Nadir asked about kick and bass phase. It said, what informs your decision? This is a perfect thing. We got a great whip. I put up our 808 kick drum, a little clip on the Live with Matt Rad Instagram. It's also up on the YouTube Clips channel. So check that out where we talk about 808s and kick drum for a few. But maybe we can just touch on it for a second.
I want it all to be in phase. I want to hear what it's like with everything in phase first before I decide if something was better out of phase.
Well, you made the interesting point before. You always want to just use your ears, make it in phase, make it hit the hardest, that sort of thing. But it's also important to listen to, if you're mixing, the rough mix, because sometimes they might have a group of snares or kicks or something that add up a certain way that if they were actually all in phase, you'd add too much body to it, or the kick would thump in the wrong place or whatever, even though it might be in phase and better. Make sure that you're not changing, if you're only the mixer, make sure you're not changing the relationship of phase such that it no longer sounds like what the producer intended. Because it might be, I've definitely thrown,
I do that sometimes too, though.
Just be aware of it.
Like, okay, so if a bass say there's two basses, like a live bass, upper harmonics, and a sub, and they're out of phase. When you flip the phase, and you have you'll now have a shit ton of low end, but the tone won't be as nasally and buzzy, right? So that's the sound that the phasing is injecting upon. And that's what the producer had. They had this like loud, nasally bass tone. You're like, oh shit, where'd that go? Now you could just say, well, it has more low end, so now it's better. That's not objectively true, right? It feels better now that it has this, but now you must we've talked about this before. Now you must recreate, I'll hit your question later, Zach. That's not a stupid question. We can talk about that. Yeah. So I'll now recreate that with saturation techniques and exciters. Like I've talked about this exact technique in earlier episodes, but you have to make up that sound again somehow. And that takes ear training to understand where that frequency band is that created that nasal bass sound that was liked by the producer and the artist in the room when they were creating it, but now we actually have low end. Now we actually have sub that it's in phase. Now let's get both. And that's difficult. Yeah. And it's not, and sometimes it might be better, meaning get the job done faster and make everybody happy by leaving it how it was. I'm a sucker for low end. So I'm always going to put everything in phase and then remake that shit.
Well, let's talk about phase for a second. I'm gonna see if I can describe it, and please make adjustments. I know this won't be a perfect explanation, but
there's no
when something is
phase is imperfect.
When something is literally perfect in phase, it's the exact same sound, and it will just be twice as loud. So if you take a signal, copy, or take a sound, copy it to another track, those two tracks are perfectly in phase. Anything other than that, even two performances of the exact same thing lined up perfectly, is still going to be slightly out of phase. So everything is slightly out of phase. And so this is why it's such an interesting topic, is that the phase relationship will change. If you hit two, if I hit a C on this piano, which is in tune, and a C on the other piano, which is in tune, which is an upright, and I line them up to be perfectly in phase. So the fundamental frequency, the low C, is perfectly in phase. The other harmonics and the relationship of each sound might be out of phase. So there might be one way where the waveforms are lined up right on the dot for where the attack is, and the C resonates really loudly, but then when I flip the phase, I lose the bass, but I gain some other upper harmonics. And that relationship, and it might be with a bass and an 808, or a kick drum and an 808, or even a vocal and a guitar, or background vocals. Oftentimes, if you're using lots of auto-tune on background vocals, they'll start phasing and smearing, so you actually don't want to tune everything. You want, that's what a chorus effect is you're taking the signal, you're duplicating it, you're delaying it, you're pitching it. That's what phase and flanger and all those things are.
It's very desirable.
Yeah, so the thickness of sounds often comes from them being somewhat out of phase or out of time. And so that relationship is essentially what we're talking about, and it applies to basically everything, anything that's in a similar frequency range. So the idea of a kick and an 808 and bass drum all being in or out of phase is really about experience and using your ears, because sometimes you want the impact to be a certain way, or maybe you flip the phase and then you remove some of the low end off the bass guitar so it really sings here, but then the kick is subby. There's all kinds of ways to do it and think about it.
Yeah, it's another thing you have to practice. It's visual, you can line things up, but you also have to be listening. And sometimes you want to hollow out a bass sound by flipping the phase on it, and it'll thin up out the upper harmonics and let that sub sit down low. And again, that's something that we just have to, it's a taste. But if you're a mixer and the sound of the bass is coming from it being out of phase, then you're going to have to recreate that sound because the producer's going to be like, what the fuck happened to my bass?
Yeah, things being out of phase can result in interesting sounds.